Welcome to the LongCovidPodcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I'm really excited today to be chatting to Lynn Laidlaw and Tracy Ibbotson, and we're going to talk about all sorts of things around research, research involvement and PPI. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So to start with, could you each give just a brief introduction to yourselves and what it is that you do?
So hi, my name's Lynn Laidlaw and I stay in central Scotland, and I live with one of the rare autoimmune rheumatic diseases in overlap with inflammatory arthritis and multiple long-term conditions. And I had a 4-year diagnostic odyssey to get my diagnosis, and the experiences that I had on that journey prompted my interest in research. And I discovered this wonderful thing called patient and public involvement. And I've been involved ever since then, just working with research teams to just improve research, just to make it meaningful to people living with diseases. And then in the last 18 months, myself, another patient and an academic rheumatologist wrote and submitted an application, a grant application, and we were funded. And I've been doing some patient-led, co-produced qualitative research into people's experiences of shielding, because I've had to shield in the pandemic. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Well, my name's Tracy Ibbotson, and I am the public and patient involvement, and I'm just going to use PPI from now on, lead for the medical school at the University of Glasgow. And so I came into this with frustration about how kind of information patients were getting about studies, and finding ways to make that better, make it more understandable for people. So that was about 8 years ago, and I've just gradually got more and more involved in meeting people like Jackie and Lynn and other patients to talk about research.
Fantastic. So you've got kind of two sides of the coin between you, I think, which is really, really interesting here. Maybe before we go further, you've both mentioned PPI, or patient and public involvement. Could you describe what that means?
Well, the official line is public and patient involvement is about doing research with people and involving them in the decisions about the research design, rather than doing it for them or to them. So it means that people with, say, lived experience of a heart condition, and it's a study about heart conditions, they would be asked questions about, does this study make sense? Would people be able to do it? So somebody might be saying, yes, we'll call people into the hospital 3 times a week to get tests done while we're doing this experimental drug. And the heart failure people or heart condition people might say, well, actually, do you know what? It's actually quite difficult for me to get in 3 times a week, and I don't think people will do it. I think if you change your design and only ask them to come in once a week, that might be better. Or if they could go to their GP, that might be better. So you can see then that patients are talking about how the design can change, and things about the information leaflets as well about a study. Do they make sense, or is it all jargon? Is it all words that nobody understands, and you get halfway through and you think, oh, I'm just going to bin that because I don't understand it anyway. So it's getting people who have the experience of the disease to come in and say, does this make sense? Is it going to work if we do it? It's different from actually taking part in research. That's a different thing. If you're taking part in research, you go in and you maybe fill questionnaires, or you take a new drug, or you do a rehabilitation exercise, something like that. That's a different thing. Good thing as well, but just a different thing. So that's public patient involvement is about people with lived experience giving their ideas about the study to make it more successful. And ultimately, that's why people do PPIE, because it's going to make the research more meaningful and more acceptable for people who have a lived experience.
I think that's a really good description. And, I think the thing about patient-public involvement is that we're limited by our imagination, and that actually patients and the public can get involved all the way. We talk about the research process from coming up from the original idea, what is it we want to research, through doing the research and the methods and analysing the research and then reporting it and then disseminating it, getting it out there. And patients and the public can be involved at any part in that process and should be involved in all parts of the process. Often we find that they're involved in some parts more than others, So, everyone wants you to have a look at their lay summary, their plain English summary, or have a look at the patient information sheet. They're maybe not quite so keen to have a conversation with you about what's the outcome of this research, what's meaningful to the people living with this disease, because what's meaningful to people living with disease is often quite different to what's meaningful to a researcher or to a clinician. And so I look upon it as combining perspectives. I think we've all got different perspectives, and it's the combination of those perspectives, bringing it together, that makes research the best that it can be.
Or a bit tense.
Yes, yeah, because there's lots of productive tensions. I love that phrase. It comes from a paper by Sarah Knowles, and there's lots of productive tensions within that. But ultimately, I will say that no one will care more about research than the people living with diseases and conditions. And if I didn't think that I could help, I wouldn't waste researchers' time, because it's too important.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I'm coming from. I can help.
Yeah, the researchers have such a different agenda that it's so important to get that real life aspect about the research as well. The research agenda is, because of their job and the way they're employed, they have to get grant funding in, so they have to follow a certain pathway to do that. And they're driven to do it, and they have very little time to do much else. So it's good for them to get that real life input from somebody, because then they themselves are going to do research that's much more meaningful. But sometimes it's like stopping a line of ship and getting it to turn around and look at things in a different way, especially when the research is under such pressure to produce the whole time, papers and grants and so on, and to stand back and then go look at something from a different perspective can be quite challenging, but worthwhile. But that's the thing, that's the bottom line, it is worthwhile.
Yeah, and I think, if you look at the things that are important to patients concentrate much more on maybe what we would term the softer outcomes, such as quality of life, whereas a lot of research, I think, traditionally has very much concentrated on the harder outcomes. It's mortality, 1 year mortality, 5 year mortality, or admission to hospital. Whereas, for a lot of us patients, it's about how can our day-to-day quality of life be better? How can we improve that?
Yeah, and I think it's one of the asthma charities. I'm not entirely sure about the name, so I'm not going to mention the name just in case. But one of the asthma charities, they did a big fundraiser and they managed to get quite a substantial amount of money. So they were going to commission all this research, and they thought, well, we'll just do it onto cures for asthma. But what they did was they went back to some patient groups and asked them, well, what do you want this money to be spent on? And funnily enough, these patient groups did not say, oh yeah, it'd be great to get a cure. They said, well, you're already doing stuff on cures, so we know that. Well, we've got a problem with our quality of life at the moment. We would like you to do research that's going to help us in the here and now living with asthma. So that is a really good example of priority setting, as they call it, in research. And that's a really good example of how having the real life experience can make the research better or more meaningful. And as Lynn said, it's measuring things that people want to have measured.
Yes, of course, because the people with the condition are going to, like you say, have a very different perspective on it. But, they're going to know what they want out of it, I guess, because they're living with it.
Yeah, exactly. And by and large, it's public money as well. So the researchers have to be accountable, or the funding bodies have to be accountable to government and have to be transparent about it.
Yeah, and I think, if you look back at the history of patient public involvement, a lot of it grew out of this right-based movement, no decision about me without me, and was heavily influenced by, people with HIV and whatever, who really, shook up the research agenda. It's got some interesting history, but when you start to look back, and just this real advocacy, and this ongoing fight to be heard and to be taken account of.
That's the sort of phrase they use now, isn't it? Patient voices.
Yeah. And it's not where, I think we've moved a long way, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, for sure. We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. So, although you're obviously both very involved in PPI, you've had very different routes to this point, I think. Would you mind chatting just a little bit about what brought you to this point, I suppose?
I mean, I think for me, so I mentioned before about having this diagnostic odyssey. So, I was living my life, but, my career was going well and whatever. And then one day I got unwell and I got these symptoms and I was back and forth to my GP. And my GP was absolutely excellent. And I had a lot of symptoms and they didn't quite make sense. And I know that this will really resonate with a lot of people living with long COVID. And, my GP was great. So they did some tests and nothing quite showed up. So then it was, like I say, 4 years of, I talk about my path to diagnosis kind of being like a boomerang. My patient would chuck the boomerang out to like secondary care and they would chuck it back, saying, no, not to do with us. And then always got like a multidisciplinary merry-go-round, where I was going to one specialist and then another specialist and then another specialist. And because of the way the health service is set up, which is around this single organ diseases, they would say, well, yep, there's nothing wrong with your eyes, or we can't see anything wrong with your joints or whatever. But no one was looking at me holistically. No one was looking at me as a whole. And I was lucky. I was privileged because I was health literate, because I had resources, because I had the support of my family. And I had about 12 second opinions all over the UK until I got my diagnosis. And, doctors will say to you, the diagnosis doesn't matter, but it does matter, because sometimes until you get a diagnosis, you can't get evidence-based treatment. And I needed to get my diagnosis to get on a medication, a biologic medication, which is an expensive medication, which has made such a difference to my quality of life. And I think for me, there was, I was told that my symptoms were significantly psychological. And the real thing for me was not being believed. I was just so awful. And I remember when I was told this by this consultant, significantly psychological, going to see my GP, and my GP spending 40 minutes with me and saying to me, the problem is, Lynn, he said, they can't prove that, but it's really difficult to disprove as well. So it was that lack of belief in me that I found really difficult to cope with. And also, when I was on my diagnostic odyssey and I made up my own notes, I got a copy of all my results, of the clinic letters that were very subjective about me and my symptoms, and, just making comments about it. And I learned one of the hardest things was to learn not to have hope. I had to learn not to hope, because to be let down time and time again, to think, this is the day that I'm going to get the answer. This is the day that someone's going to really listen to me. And then to have that hope dashed. So I had to learn not to hope. I had to learn to curate my symptoms, because I think, I had so many symptoms, and it was like doctors just couldn't cope with that. It's like their brain exploded or something. So you had to learn, to cut down the amount of symptoms that I was telling them about. But then the problem with that was that, what if you miss out the one vital symptom? Because it was like I was driving this process, but I was the one with the least knowledge. And I was the one that was driving this process. So yeah, it was just this situation. And, I think what drives my involvement is I don't want anyone to go through what I went through. I was lucky in that, I had access to a clinical psychologist through my work, and she was amazing. And, I saw her monthly, and she said to me, "You're not mad, Lynn. I believe in you." And I think it took me a long time to come to terms with what happened to me, but I had to come to terms with what happened to me in order to be able to go on to be involved. And that was a long process. And, I blogged a bit about my emotional and diagnostic odyssey, but it took me 4 years to get to that stage. And like I say, what drives me is that I don't want anyone to have the experience that I had. And I think people that are involved come from that lived experience, come from that emotional connection to research and to their experiences, which is great. But the downside is that it can be emotionally challenging and difficult as well. But involvement's given me so much. For someone that was forced to retire and felt flung in the scrap heap at age 50, I'm in a completely different place now. And a lot of that's down to involvement.
That's amazing. I mean, so much of what you've just said is going to resonate certainly with myself and with everybody else with long COVID. Yeah, that's amazing that you've turned it around to the point where you're now helping other people. It's awesome. Sorry, I've butted in before Tracy got a chance to tell her story.
No, that's a good point, Jackie. I think it's good for people to hear Lynn's experience. Well, Lynn and I do some teaching in university, and I'm always really keen for Lynn to talk about her experience, because it just brings it all to life, and it just says why we're doing it, and why it's important. But anyway, my experience is not quite as important as that, but it's mildly interesting. Basically, I work as 2 jobs. I do the PPI, but I also do research coordinator for a research network in primary care. And as part of that job, we would go out to GP practices to identify people eligible for taking part in studies and send out an invite to them. And we always had these information packs that we sent out to patients, and usually they came from the hospitals. And so there were big, huge, chunky packs of about 25 pages. And I could just, we would spend all this time trying to find patients and printing up letters, stuffing the envelopes, and looking. Nobody's going to read this, because the minute it comes through their door, they're going to take one look at the big pack and it's going to go into the circular filing cabinet. So that was the one thing that kind of played in my mind. Then there was another thing where, patients were invited to come into, like for instance, Glasgow Royal to take part in the study. And obviously they wanted to have people from more deprived areas of Glasgow. And so I would say, well, okay, are you going to pay their bus fares? And they said, no, because it's, they usually come into the Royal anyway. And I said, but it's an extra, it's pint milk, a loaf of bread, that person's going to be spending to come and do study. So these kind of things were floating around. And then I saw part of the strategy for the research network had what was called a public patient involvement strategy. I thought, oh, that looks good. Maybe I could do something like that. So, they said my bosses were happy with that. So we set up a group of people, and this was in about 2015, and we met at the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. And what that group started off doing was looking at just the information leaflets that people get about studies that they're asked to take part in. And we would talk about jargon and whether people could understand it, why it was so long. A good example of a jargon was they were doing a study on AI, and so they kept saying that in the information leaflet, AI this, AI that, and eventually the member of the group said, I do wonder about this because my friend is a veterinary nurse, and to her AI is just artificial insemination. So where's his study going? So that's a good example of how the group did it. Since then, the group stayed with us, and we still, unfortunately, meet Zoom. We don't meet face-to-face, but I hope we will start to meet face-to-face soon. We now go on to look at grant applications, at the way the research plan is set out, sometimes looking at analysis. I have another 4 groups within the university. Lynn helped me set up one of them. Lynn and I are now doing a lot of teaching for the students, staff and students. And then, of course, most recently is the LongCovid group that we have. And that is super exciting from my perspective. And I don't want to belittle people's experience of long COVID, because I know that has been horrendous for people. But what is exciting is that here's the start of a new disease, here's us working out what the treatments are, and here's us with the patients involved right at the beginning. And so we have a COVID group in Glasgow University, and we have researchers who come with us to studies, and we can take that to the patients and say, right, does this make sense? Is this what you want to have? And I think it's really interesting because the researchers are coming with their ideas from previous kind of conditions. And here's this new condition, and the patients are the experts. They know the most about living with it. So there's a real kind of, how can we talk about this? How can we switch that actually maybe what one person's thinking is not going to fit in? So it's really good. And what I like about it is, the other thing is, because of Long COVID Scotland, people are so engaged, and these people who are living with long COVID are very good at getting their viewpoints over. They've had enough and they're fed up, rightly so, and they're really pushing the researchers, and that is great. And that is what most of the researchers really enjoy, even though they're kind of, oh my goodness, what's happening? But I do think for the most of them, they do find that's a rewarding part of it as well. So that's gone from, stuffing envelopes with rubbish information leaflets to a new kind of disease and having patients involved in it.
Yeah, I mean, long COVID has been so patient-led, I guess, right from the start, isn't it?
Well, the term was defined by patients, wasn't it?
Exactly. So it's really awesome that patients are getting more involved in the research, because, like you say, that can only have advantages, can't it? I mean, that was my next question, actually. Why is it so important to have patients involved in research? And I think we've sort of answered that already.
Yeah, I think it's just to make it relevant and meaningful and of benefit to patients. And let's not forget, a lot of the funding bodies now require it. So the research community are under pressure to do it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it improves research as well, and I think this can be quite a tension in patient public involvement, because a lot of research is set up around, show me the impact, let's evaluate it. And I think that the way that we evaluate research is around a lot of hard outcomes and whatever, whereas in many ways patient public involvement is about relationships. Tracy and I have known each other for quite a few years now, and there's been some sticky moments, but we've built that relationship, and we And we've had the conversations and we come through it. And essentially that's what it's about. And, there's a lot of people that, I think there's this tension when we're trying to evaluate patient-public involvement and look for the evidence, because can we always measure what's meaningful to people? And how can you measure the influence that patient-public involvement has had in my life? How can you measure how it's changed a researcher's way of thinking and then has gone on to influence other research that they have done? And a lot of it, like I say, is about these conversations. It's about the collaboration. It's about building the relationships. And that takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes resources, it takes money. And that can be challenging in this research world that moves at 100 miles an hour, and that Tracy says, it's like, you must do this, you must do that. And what was really interesting was at the start of the pandemic, normally applications, the Health Research Authority that runs the ethics service, there would be, like 70 or 80% of research going to it would have some patient-public involvement. At the start of the pandemic, that fell to 20%. And I think it just really showed that patient-public involvement wasn't as embedded in research as we thought it was. But then what's happened since then is that it's absolutely grown. And I agree with Tracy. I'm just filled with awe and admiration from what people with long COVID have achieved in just advocating for themselves, advocating for their involvement, really pushing the research agenda, saying, no, we're not interested in graded exercise therapy. This is what you need to be looking at, all when living with this horrible, debilitating condition, with all these horrible symptoms that, they just haven't been able to access good care for and whatever. And what you have achieved is absolutely fabulous. It really is.
Yeah, that's fab. And that's great that, it is getting more people involved in the process. And like you said, Tracy, if it's becoming a requirement, is that making it more kind of entrenched in the process?
Mm-hmm. It is. And yes. I think the issue with that is that there are a lot of researchers, and I would say probably the older researchers, because they've never had to do it in the past, that don't know about this. So this is a new thing they've got to learn, so they've got to think. The younger researchers, they're just learning about everything. So in a way, I think it's easier for them to integrate it. I don't know. I mean, that might be a bit of a sweeping statement, but I know for some people, academic staff find it easier than others to do it. But they know they have to do it, and they'll come and see me, and I'll say, well, what about this X, Y, and Z, and you maybe want to do the other and the other, and then you can see them visibly fading away. But then the flip side of that is we usually do a lot of work is done through group meetings. And you ask a researcher to come and present their work to a group. And these people, obviously with lived experience, have come from a different perspective, and they will give a different point of view. And sometimes it can be a very, very simple thing. It usually is, but it's a game changer. And you can see the light bulb moment in the researcher's head when I see why this works now. I see why public and patient work, because I hadn't thought about that. That's brilliant. And I always say to anybody, any of our staff who are doing it, any member of the public who's interested, actually, to come along to one of the groups and just watch it in action, and you'll see, you'll see what it means, because it's, as Lynn was saying, it's a lot about relationships. So it's hard to explain that without going a bit kind of Californian on you, so.
Yeah, that's amazing. So thinking about it from the perspective of a patient now, what is the benefit to patients in getting involved in research? And are there things that might put people off? I'm thinking maybe such as having to travel, time and energy, maybe. And are there maybe ways of working around that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm working up a grant application with a group just now. And what we're really looking at is like flipping the power, because at the moment we are kind of invited into the research world And what would that look like if researchers came into our world? And I think that there is, so funders are mandating patient-public involvement, and that can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing because it can lead to tokenism. And I think that there's a lot of interest now in community engagement and in working with communities, especially communities that have been seldom heard, that have been underserved, underrepresented. And I think that COVID and Black Lives Matter has really shone a light on the inequalities in society. And inclusivity and diversity, equality is a really big thing now in patient and public involvement. But again, that requires resource, because it requires coming into people's worlds and spending time in community and building those relationships, not just helicoptering in and out. I mean, I've talked about the benefit to me, the benefit that can accrue being involved. Some of the experiences I've had. I'm doing research. I've been all over the UK. I've been to Europe. I've been on Sky TV and BBC Breakfast News, talking about some of the stuff that I've been involved in. But I've also had some pretty crappy experiences, and I've managed to come back from those. And I think that when the involvement is transactional, when you feel that people are extracting things from you, then that can be very, very difficult to come to terms with. That would be one downside. And I think the other thing is, not making reasonable adjustments. And, we go on about the lack of inclusivity, diversity in research, that research involvement is full of white middle-class females like me. Well, is that because I've been able to, navigate this world, because if you don't pay people for their time, if you don't have resources to pay people for their time, online involvement is not cost-free. People need the tech, they need the Wi-Fi connections, you need to pay people's travelling expenses, you need to understand that people are living with disease, and you need to make reasonable adjustments and not have like all-day meetings. If you're going to meet for a couple of hours, have a break in the middle. All these things, researchers need to come into our world to make it happen. And if they want to reach out to seldom heard communities, then they need to come into that community's world, and they need to spend time with them, and they need to get to know them, not parachute in and piss off again when they've got what they've wanted. And I think that, unfortunately, inclusivity and diversity in research has become almost like a tick box in itself. It's like, find me a person that embodies this characteristics, whether it's in terms of gender or ethnic community, or that, so I can tick a box to say that I've involved them, rather than let's go and meaningfully work with these communities where they are. Because I'll say often the only power I have is the power to walk away from involvement that doesn't value me. And if I don't value myself and what I can bring to research, then no one else is going to.
We'll be right back. Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much.
I would agree with everything that Lynn said there, but particularly I think for me it's relationship building. It's like a research method. Honestly, a lot of people have research methods that they bring, whether it's focus groups or questionnaires or whatever, but it's not that. It's about getting to know people, because basically anybody who's involved in PPI is because of their lived experience with their condition. So they're talking about themselves. It's not like the research is talking about their theory of blindy blogs, or statistician is talking about standard deviations far away from the norm, which is all quite objective. It's people are bringing their stories about their lives. So you need to respect that, and you need to be able to give people space to do that in any way, which form. And oftentimes it's not about coming to a group. Sometimes it's different ways of doing it. If somebody has literacy issues, it's no point in me sending out reams of paper documents. I can sit and have a chat with them about it. That's going to work. Or if somebody's, from an ethnic minority group, I could go and talk to them, but I could be saying completely the wrong thing. It wouldn't be the thing to encourage people to take part. But if I learn about that community, if I know somebody who's a community champion who can teach me how I can get my ideas over, that's grand. And I think it's the same with people coming from really deprived backgrounds. And I don't think we appreciate how deprived some people are living. There are people who are worried about what they're going to put on the table for tea tonight. I mean, it's that level of poverty. And so how do we speak about research? What's going to be the relevant thing there? And yet those are oftentimes people who are more prone to have all these health conditions. So we'll have to find ways of saying to them, is this going to work in your life? And that is a real challenge. And I don't think we've got the answers for that yet, but we're still working on it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I love this idea of bringing the researchers into our world, because I think for a lot of people, this idea of research and science is sort of like men in white coats, and it sounds very inaccessible. And this idea that actually, little old me actually could be of use, and actually not just that, is an important part of it. It's quite a new idea for me, and I'm sure it is for other people as well.
Yeah, it's definitely not about men with white coats.
So yeah, it's that kind of stereotypical researcher in a lab, isn't it?
But sometimes that could be quite interesting, because we did a Zoom meeting with people who worked in the labs at Glasgow University, and it was people who had bloodborne viruses, and they were talking about their experiences of living with a bloodborne virus, and then they were talking about the people in white coats and how they're experts and how they're amazing. And I just say, no, they're not. They're amazing to a certain extent, yes, but there are other things that you're more amazing in. And it's just a knowledge that you could learn. And they were saying, oh, what about those test tubes you've got? What about those test tubes? What do they all mean? They've all got different colours. And the guy said to him, he says, oh, actually it doesn't mean anything. Different colours don't mean anything. And because he was in his lab, he was able to bring all the stuff out. So it was great. We had this big chat about, the researchers saying, well, and we take an aliquot of this. And somebody said, I don't mean to sound stupid, but what's an aliquot? I said, oh, right. Well, an aliquot is just a sample. And because they do have this brilliant intelligence, and they can take all these subsamples, thousands of subsamples from one. So people will be able to learn, all right, if I give one blood sample, that could be used in thousands of research projects. So it's just good for them to learn about that, but it was also good for people living in the labs to meet people, real life people with a condition. I mean, living in a lab, you don't even meet people. I mean, you just meet test tubes. But they could meet real people who had to go through the experience of living with a bloodborne virus. And oftentimes when they go to clinics, they'll be told to wait till the end so they don't infect anybody else. And, really, they have some quite uncomfortable experiences in their lives. So I think that for the researchers, that was good for them to learn, oh my gosh, this blood sample hasn't just come from a person with this virus. It's come from a person with this virus who's had these experiences in their lives. And that's why I'm doing this work.
Yeah, it sounds quite eye-opening from both sides then.
Yeah, it is.
I think it can be, because I think, sometimes you're doing what they call preclinical research. So you're doing, basic science in the lab, you're doing a lot of data research. Then, I will say to people, I'm more than a data point. Don't reduce me to a data point. And I think when you get scientists that are working, scientists get the same as doctors in a way, they get very, very focused on, and I will say to people who do immunology, I'm not just a mass of B cells, because if that's what they are studying. And I think it's really nice that Tracy was saying about, kind of getting researchers when they're young. And I think we're seeing more. So I did some podcasts with a PhD student on the whole issue of empowerment. What do we mean by the term empowerment? Who gets to define it? I'm supervising a PhD at Bournemouth University. I've been made a visiting fellow there, so there's these things, where actually people with lived experience are working with PhD students, with fellows, throughout their career. So then it just becomes a normal part of the research process, rather than something that you kind of have to do, or that's a kind of a bolt on. And I think we're going to see that more and more. Tracy and I have been asked, we spoke to master's students the other week, and actually I did a session on co-production with some master's students at Oxford University this morning. So get them early. That's what I say. Get them early, indoctrinate them, and then we'll...
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of made it sound like a bit of a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you involve patients in research? But why might researchers setting up a study not want to involve patients? Or is it more of an oversight when it doesn't get done?
Oh, there's so many reasons. Well, I mean, I'll give you one example. We had somebody who came presented at one of the groups, and this guy was a PhD student, and he was super intelligent. He was amazing, and he'd written a PhD project about what Lynn was calling their big data. So it's taking these huge, massive data sets. I don't know, we have heard of the biobank study, which is data that's been collected from people over years, and it's all about their lifestyles, their bloods, their health. So all these massive banks of data. Scotland, CSO, is Chief Scientist's Office, has got a huge department called Information and Statistics Division, or it was called that. I don't know if it still is, but ISD. So they've got huge data from hospitals about births, deaths, prescriptions, all this massive stuff. So anyway, he's looking at this project, and it was super, super intelligent written up. Unfortunately, nobody in the room could understand a word he was saying. Not one of us could understand a word he was saying. And then he said, well, actually, this research is for a very specific group of researchers who will be able to understand it. And we had to say, and this is a light bulb moment I was talking about earlier, and we had to say to him, actually, no, the research ultimately is for people. It's to go out into practice. And you could see him pausing and think about it. And to be fair, he really took it on board. And the people who were there were really supportive of him, because he got roughly what his idea was. And they were saying things like, why don't you try and write it out again, but just write what's called the LACE summary, just a short version of it in non-jargon, non-scientific speak. Bring it back to us, and then we'll talk to you about your study. So that's just somebody who just didn't know about it. And then I think there are obviously there'll be some researchers who don't believe that they can learn anything. They just want to continue working the way. I mean, that's few and far between. I think the main barrier for researchers is time. They might get something like 6 weeks to knock up a research proposal, and they've got to try and get public involvement in it. And okay, arguably you could say, well, they should be doing that with their work long before, but they're not funded to do that. So they have to get grant funded to actually pay people to be involved. So it's a bit of a vicious circle. So the great thing about Glasgow is you've got me, who's there to try and facilitate this, is to try and help research who's at that point. And the great thing for me is I have people like Lynn and all the other people that I know now with lived experience that I can say to them, oh, listen, there's something coming up. Could you have a look at this lay summary for this researcher? They've got a short deadline. I'm sorry about it. It's a short deadline. If you could, that would be good. Another one is that people will say, well, I don't know, how do I pay people to be involved? What do I have to pay them for? So again, just standards now that are recommended, which I can point them in the direction of that. But it's all these people who perhaps have gone through doing their research training, they'll not come across it. And then all of a sudden they start reading an application form for funding, and it's a paragraph that says, what's your PPI involvement? And they're like, oh gosh, what is that all about? That's where people slip into tokenism, because they just think, I've not got the time and I've not got the resources to do this. I'll just try and patch something together. But it's always better if they can run it past at least a couple of people, because they get that light bulb moment.
I think time and resources are huge, and you've got to make those available. And I'm not sure that, we've been the best at that. Now everything's online, but before the pandemic, I was down in London every month. I was doing a lot more patient-public involvement because it was better resourced in England than I was in Scotland. So interestingly, there's a big announcement out today driven by the Health Research Authority and NIHR in England, and National Research Scotland has signed up to the CSO office, Wales, and just, lots of big research organisations saying that, yes, involvement is expected and it's necessary. So we'll see. I think time and resources get in the way of it. It's interesting, some of the debates in involvement, because, some people will think there's a really big debate about once you get like me and you get research literate and whatever, if you're actually really a patient. So it's often like public contributors to research have to be like Goldilocks porridge, and we have to be just right. But who gets to define what just right is? So on the one hand, oh no, I can't involve that Lynn Laidlaw because she's far too experienced, and she's not patient-like anymore. She's far too caught up in the research world. And then for other opportunities, it's like, send in a 2-page CV or write 2 pages about why we should involve you, and then let 3 of us interview you for an hour. And no, sorry, you don't have enough experience for that. So a lot of this essentially is about power. And it's about understanding the role that power plays. It's understanding who has the power, who doesn't have the power, and understanding that you need to cede power. And there is, for some people, some researchers will just, because I can hold them to account in a way that maybe others can't, and they don't like that. Whereas other researchers absolutely totally embrace that. But what I would say is, in this world where a lot of funders are mandating it, don't do it tokenistically. Because to me, involvement and things like co-production are values driven. They're not methods, they're ways of working. And they incorporate values such as power sharing, such as equality, such as trust, such as inclusivity. And if you can't work that way, be reflective enough and have enough insight to realise that you can't sign up to that, and don't do it, leave it to someone else, because it's the harms that you can do to people by involving them in a kind of tokenistic way. So I think, there are problems with resources and time. There's a problem that some people just don't want to do it. And then there's a problem that a lot of researchers don't want to power share.
Yeah, I think the power thing is really important. I think one of the things that I've kind of learned is I'll be at meetings with a public patient involvement person and they'll be saying something and they're getting pushed back from the researcher. And I think what I've learned is, because I would always just let the discussion go ahead, but what I've learned to do now is to actually intervene and say, I think what that person's trying to say to you is X, Y, and Z. And then it addresses the power balance a wee bit. And I think people like in my position should be perhaps doing that a bit more as well. Again, it's a work in progress.
Because it's exhausting. It's exhausting to pop your head above the parapet all the time, to be shot at. It's exhausting, saying, no, I don't think. It's exhausting sitting on committees with everyone else that's a professor, and you're often the only patient there. And, I think to have allies like Tracy and other researchers in that space is fundamental.
Though I have to say, sometimes I find if I'm sitting on panels and so researchers as well, I can find that quite intimidating as well.
Yeah, that balance of power thing is interesting because, I guess patients probably do feel like they're sort of on the wrong side of that balance, where actually it feels like they should be equals at least. So if there are people listening who are thinking that they might be interested in getting involved with research and PPI for long COVID research or any other research, because you guys have really sold it. How would they go about it if they're in, well, I suppose depending on where they are, it'll be different, but...
Well, I'm happy to talk to anybody. As Lynn knows, I'm happy to talk to anybody. I'm happy to have a chat, whether it be on Zoom. I'm also happy to meet for coffee and what have you. If somebody wants to come along and have a look at one of the groups and see how they fill out, then they can come along to a group and see how it works. If they would just like to be on a register, we can take their name and address and contact them to say, well, if you've got any projects that come up about X, Y, or Z, I'd be really interested in that. We can do that as well. As I said before, we have got the Long COVID PPI group, which meets every couple of months or so. People would be more than welcome to that. I'm delighted to say that we can reimburse people for coming to the meetings and any travel expenses or remote access expenses as well, we cover as well. So
I think it's getting easier. I mean, when I started out, I found that getting involved was a lot of work until you get plugged into networks, because it's like researchers, we can't find people to get involved. And I think at that point, in Scotland, I was knocking on doors, I was emailing people and whatever, and I was just getting doors slammed in my face, left, right, and centre. So, so I talk about, I had this diagnostic odyssey, and then I had this involvement odyssey. It was quite similar in terms of the amount of time and effort I had to put into becoming involved. So I think, to reach out to people like Tracy, and there's, I think Aberdeen University has, some works in PPI. And
I mean, if anybody wants to find out contacts for the local areas, there's Tayside's got a contact, Aberdeen's got a contact, with Cara Portius in Edinburgh as well. So there's lots of contacts we can direct people to. And there's also a thing called the People in Research website. And if you Google People in Research, it's where researchers advertise their projects that they want public involvement in. So we'll say we're looking for people who have got experience of heart failure, who might want to work on a rehab study that we're doing. It's going to be running for the next 3 years. You'll find the contacts and everything on there. That's quite a good one.
And then there's just a lot of institutions to get, like, the Health Research Authority has a really good public involvement network that you can sign up with the NIHR, the National Institute of Health Research, to be a reviewer with them and get involved with them. I think that the most successful route for me has definitely been Twitter. But it's a bit a double-edged sword, because, I went on Twitter, but actually then Twitter became like work, because I think if you go on Twitter, you need to be on every day, and you need to kind of be building up your profile, and you need to get connected with people. But I would say that about 90% of the things that I'm involved in has come through Twitter, until you get a kind of critical mass of involvement. And then I would say it's only maybe in the last 18 months that people have been approaching me to say, Lynn, would you like to get involved in this? Whereas before it was me, hustling and hunting down opportunities. And I think if you have long COVID, then, I think the group that Tracy has set up is a perfect starting point. And then, and I realised that a lot of people are not going to be like me. I've kind of made it not my life, because it's not my life. It doesn't define me, but, I do a lot. I'm doing stuff every day, and a lot of people don't want to do that. So I think it's finding a level that you're comfortable with doing. And the other thing, if I can give people a bit of advice, and when I talked before about coming to terms with what happened, and I think that's quite important as well, and it's learning to use your lived experience to illustrate a point, to say, I think you should change your research, or I think you should change your outcome, and this is why, and then using an example. I think that bad things happen to you and you don't get good care, and you've had a terrible experience, and you don't have an outlet to voice that. And it's trying to turn that, and thinking about what is relevant about my lived experience that I can bring to this. What examples can I use about things that have happened to me to try and illustrate the point that I'm making? But you maybe need to process a bit of what happened to you that's a bit challenging before you can really start to become involved in work people. And I hope that doesn't sound horrible or whatever, but it's certainly been my experience.
Yeah, I think that's quite a good point, actually, because there's an awful lot of stuff involved in such an experience, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to come to terms with, and I absolutely get that. And very little help and support to enable people to do that.
Well, I will pop links in the show notes to those websites that you've mentioned, and people can obviously get in touch with me and I can signpost them. People outside of Scotland, there's the Long COVID Support Research Group in, I think that's England and Wales, isn't it? And outside of the UK, there will be similar things worldwide, I guess. I guess the best way to get in touch is maybe through sort of long COVID groups in those countries, probably.
Yeah, I mean, if it's just long COVID, then you go that. But there's also things like the EUPATI, which is the European Patients Association, so, and it's interesting to see how other countries are doing it as well. And, there's a lot of shared information. They might be useful.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for chatting to me today. It's been really, really awesome to hear about all that you've been doing and how important it is that people get involved in research. So I hope this might inspire some more people to get involved, whether they're in Scotland or the UK or anywhere else around the world. So, thank you so much for your time, guys.
Oh, thank you so much for the invite to do it. This is great fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much to all of my guests and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/LongCovidPod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.